Part 1, the beginning. Robert was disgusted at the world. Mrs. Riley, his landlady, had just thrown him out. She was not usually so forceful in her behavior. She had just barred the door to him. He had spent the last 4 hours touring the dirty populated streets, wondering what he was going to do with himself. He huddled in the doorway of a derelict shop as he tried to keep himself dry. Further down the street, 2 homeless people were huddled in another doorway, keeping the rain off them. He did not relish the thought of a life on the streets. He was a small man with a thick head of black hair. He hardly grew any facial hair, and his body was covered apart from the usual bush between his legs with a sparse covering. He looked down the street again and shivered at the thought what he would have to suffer living on the streets. He hunched his shoulders and hurried out of this part of the town towards the better lit areas. He avoided looking at people as he had the feeling that he was being watched closely by someone. He walked quickly to the better side of town and stopped outside a boutique keeping dry by standing under the awning that shaded its window display from sunlight. He stood there thinking about what had happened, and he started to realize what had caused Mrs. Riley to throw him out. Tony Harris had called round the night before and had badgered Robert to go out for a bit of fun. He was the sort of person that was not a leader but a follower due to his diminutive stature. He had always been the same, and as he was a child from care, he learned the best way to avoid bullying was to go along with the bigger children. Tony had talked Robert into joining him, and they stole a car to do a bit of joy riding. They had been stopped by the local cops, and they had arrested Tony as he was wanted for multiple counts of auto theft. They had released Robert after 6 hours with a warning, and the young man had returned to his bedside. Mrs. Riley had been waiting for him, and her face was drawn into a pinched scowl. She waited for him to explain his actions. As she waited, she looked him up and down. His appearance was much to be desired, to say the least. She had stood there dressed in her business suit and had launched into tirade about how she would never give a room to a criminal. With that, she had slammed the door in his face, not even allowing him to pick up his belongings. This caused him to stand there for at least 5 minutes, staring open-mouthed at the firmly closed door. After he had decided that he would walk through town and later return to try and get his property after the irate woman had time to calm down. As he stood under the awning, he looked at his soaked clothes and the mess the rain had made of his hair. He turned and looked down at the concrete pavement under his feet. He saw a fist-sized stone. This he picked up and weighed it in his hand. It was a comfortable weight. He bounced it in his palm and considered what had happened with his life. He turned towards the street and tossed the stone. The toss he misjudged, and he slipped also. The stone went flying from his hand and it punched a clean hole in the plate glass of the window. He stood there for a few seconds, shocked at what he had done. He hurried on, sure that he had the word vandal tattooed to his face. The feeling that he was being watched was getting strong. He turned to an intersection and stood there for a few seconds, and he considered what he was going to do. As he stood there, a sleek 4x4 pulled up beside him and the passenger window rolled down. "Hi!" The voice from inside was forceful but friendly. "Hi," Robert replied, a little unsure about where this was going. "You look as if you could do with a hand." "Yeah, life's a bitch at the moment." "Well, can I give you a lift somewhere?" "I'm not really going anywhere." "Anywhere is as good a place as any." "I'm Julia Stevens." "A pleasure, ma'am." "Well, get in." Robert climbed into the passenger seat of the 4x4 and got a good look at the woman. She looked as though she was used to being in command of the situation. She was also well dressed. She sat at the controls of the vehicle, her well-manicured hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. On her wrist there was a gold bracelet marked with a strange sigil. It looked as though it was an eye, and it seemed to be looking at Robert. As he looked at it, it seemed to wink. He did a double take and he settled back into the seat. He settled down and he could barely see above the dashboard of the large vehicle. Julia started to talk and was questioning him about his past. Julia seemed to be intent on drawing his secrets out. He was forced to consider his answers. She was asking him about his childhood and the sort of games he used to play. He had to think hard, as there was one secret he wished to keep to himself. As he was growing up in care, he used to play a lot with the girls in the home. He was happiest playing house with the young girls. He was always picked due to his size to be the little girl of the family. This he enjoyed, as it meant he was not trying to compete with the boys in something. He started to think about where he had gone wrong. the company he had been forced to keep as he grew into adolescence. They carried on talking about things as they drove through the town. The ride was smooth as the vehicle was obviously top of the line. They drove out of the town into the suburbs and the better-priced properties, and Robert was starting to wonder where he would end up. Julia stopped asking questions and was concentrating on her driving as the roads gave way to country roads. She drove like she looked, always sure of what she was doing. Robert gave his attention to the woman and he took in what she was wearing. He considered that she was what he would call power-dressed. A white blouse with a charcoal business suit, also her legs were fairly well defined. Also she looked as though she could pass as a nanny to a successful business family. He looked around the vehicle and his gaze settled on an item on the back seat. It was a child's booster seat. It was set by the rear passenger side of the vehicle. Next to it sat a rag doll. Also on the back seat was a large blonde teddy bear with a set of children's coloring books. Julia stopped the car in a lay-by next to a field. "Robert, maybe you would be happier if you could see where we are heading?" she asked gently. "Yes, ma'am, maybe that would be better. Then I could tell you when I want to get out." Julia was out of the driving seat and she walked around to the passenger door. She opened it and at the same time opened the rear door. She gestured to Robert to come round to the back. He did it and found himself lifted onto the booster seat. He flashed a quick crimson as Julia fastened the seatbelt for him. He tried to tell her that he could carry the booster seat round to the front seat. Julia told him that she was not going to break the law, as young children should travel in the rear of cars. "Ma'am, but I ain't a child," Robert protested. "If a police officer stops us, do you think that he would think you are an adult?" With that she closed the door and walked round to the driver's side of the car and they started their journey again. Robert now sat in the back seat, could see less than he could see from the front seat. He was starting to get bored, sat in the back seat, and to do something he looked at the coloring books. They were geared towards young girls and had a Disney theme. He looked out of the window and he saw that they had pulled into the driveway that looked long. They drove and as the driveway curved he could see an imposing house and they drew up to the front of the house. The car slowed, then stopped, and Robert tried to release the seatbelt. It seemed to be jammed and he had to wait for Julia to come round to release him. She quickly walked round and released him and without allowing him time to think lifted him from the seat. She also placed the teddy bear in his arms and she took his free hand. He was starting to get worried about what he had got into as he was tugged gently but firmly towards the house. They reached the steps leading up to the front of the house and Julia carried on up to the front door and entered the hallway of the house. Julia stopped and allowed Robert to look around. It was well furnished and showed good taste. Julia then led Robert towards the upstairs of the house and to a bedroom that was almost bare. She left him there, told him to freshen up as she would like to talk to him and would send the maid to fetch him. He sat on the bed in the bare room and allowed his thoughts to surface for the first time since meeting the self-assured woman. He considered the line her questions had taken and he slowly realized that she had plans for him and he wondered if he would have a say in his future. He looked around the room and he saw a door that led to an ensuite bathroom. He decided that the best thing to do was to follow the instructions and freshen up. Stripping of his jacket and shirt he washed and tried to clean himself off. It took him a little while to get himself clean again. After he had finished cleaning himself up there came a light tap on the bedroom door. "Sir, madam is ready to receive you now," a light voice informed him. He looked out at the sight of a maid dressed in a severe uniform, but her face was kind and she had a smile on her face. The voice was friendly and warm. The maid saw the teddy bear and she smiled. There was a secret behind that smile, but it was not a bad secret. She waited for Robert to join her and she led him down the corridor and downstairs. She kept up a light chatter about the house and Miss Stevens. She told him that Miss Stevens owned a chain of upmarket boutiques around the country. After hearing this, Robert started to get worried about the reason he was here. He thought about the accident with the stone. He wondered if the store was one of the ones owned by the lady that had picked him up and brought him here. Molly stopped in front of a door and knocked twice and waited for an answer. After she seemed to hear a voice from within, she ushered him into a room with wall-to-wall bookcases. Julia Stevens was sat in a deep armchair. She had a file open on her lap and she looked up and smiled. She motioned for Robert to sit himself on a footstool in front of the chair where she was sitting. Robert slowly walked across the room and sat where indicated and waited for the woman to speak. After a few seconds, Julia Stevens seemed to go back to the file that she was studying. In fact, she was watching the young man's mannerisms. After a few minutes, he seemed to relax, and her observations continued as he relaxed and seemed to lose the need to give out an image. He adjusted the way he sat, and he drew his legs together and placed his hands in his lap together lightly. Julia watched, and she thought that when he relaxed he seemed to act like a young girl. Robert sat relaxed as he waited for Julia Stevens to decide that she was ready to talk to him. He moved his body into the position that he felt was comfortable to him. He found himself relaxing into the way of sitting that the young girls in the home had taught him to sit. It seemed a comfortable and natural way for him to sit, and he seemed to relax even further. Also, as he sat there, his fingers crept to his mouth and he pulled a few strands of hair to his mouth. He started to chew on it in an unconscious mannerism that he used when he was stressed. Part 2, questions asked. After Julia had watched him for a few minutes, and when she thought him well relaxed, she closed the file with a snap. Robert jumped at the sharp sound as the file was closed firmly, and he looked up, the few strands of hair still held in his teeth. He watched as Julia Stevens reached forward and removed the hair from his mouth. She smiled gently as she saw the look of fear flick across his face. She got out of the chair and motioned for Robert to remain seated. "Robert, if I may ask a few questions, will you give me honest answers?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am, I will try." To Julia, even his manners were like a young child's when faced with her imposing presence. "Good." Julia crouched down to look Robert in the eyes. She took a deep breath, wondering if her thought were right about this. "Robert, have you ever played with girls?" "What do you mean? I ain't no rapist." "I did not mean that. You were. What I meant is that when you were younger, did you join in with the girls and their games?" Robert blushed, and he wondered what he could say now he had given his word to answer truthfully. He looked at the floor and stared at his shoes hard as he considered what this woman would think of him. She had already treated him once like a child, and he thought that she would be disgusted by the fact that as a boy up till the age of 13 he had played house. Julia waited for the reply, and she noticed that the young man was looking down at the floor. He seemed to be thinking hard about the answer, and she wondered if she had put too much pressure on him too early. She then noticed that he seemed to relax again, and the hardness left his face, as he seemed to be remembering happier times. The smile seemed to spread from nervousness to happiness very quickly, and Julia noticed that he had started to swing his legs from side to side like a young girl. "Yes, ma'am, I did. I enjoyed playing with other girls, and we played house and tea parties." Julia did a double take as she heard him speak. She thought she had heard the man mispronounce what he meant to say. Did he actually say other girls and not the girls? She started to wonder how exactly this young man viewed himself. She watched closely for a minute, and the young man started to become tense and seemed to think about how he was sitting. He slouched as he was relaxing, but Julia could see that the action was actually forced. She thought about how she would continue, and she smiled. She remembered that one set of the bookcases held children's titles. "Robert, why don't you see if the bookcase is over there?" She pointed to a set of shelves next to the fireplace. "See if there is a book you love to read." Robert stood up and walked over to the set of shelves and scanned the titles. Halfway along the third shelf was a book he always loved, and he pulled it off the shelf. He walked back to the footstool and sat down again. He opened the book and started to read and relax again. As he did this again, his mannerisms became girlish. He started to giggle at a passage in the book and did not notice Julia nod to herself and smile. She sat back down in the armchair and considered what she would do. The young man had damaged the frontage of one of her shops. She sat for 15 minutes watching the young man as he read. He was completely engrossed in the book. The title was Rapunzel. Julia wondered if Robert identified with the imprisoned princess in some way. "Roberta, do you like the book?" She deliberately used the feminine form of his name to gauge the reaction. As she said this, Robert looked up, and as he realized that she had called her Roberta, tears started to flow down his fine cheeks. Julia was worried that she had caused harm to the young man by what she had just done, and she got ready to ring for Molly to take him back to the town. "Miss Stevens, please don't think bad of me," Robert pleaded. "Why should I think bad of you?" "Because I want to be a girl." This came out as a rush of words. Robert started to explain his feelings, about his past and what his childhood was like. He felt that the little girls were treated better than the boys. That boys had to compete with each other to be the toughest. Any sign of caring about others was sissy, being good caused beatings by other boys. He had learned to hide his wishes over time and became more macho to make up for his lack of size. He had become a follower for protection, and that had led him into trouble. He had always stayed away from as much bullying as he could, as he always looked after the little kids in the home. As the young man continued with his story of his life, Julia felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She considered what her next move would be, and she decided that she needed a night to think. She felt like a fairy godmother at the birth of a princess. In some ways the analogy was a good one because of the bracelet she wore. It was called the Eye of Gaia. It was the mark of her true calling. She was a white witch, someone who used magic for the good of others. Also, she yearned for a daughter. Her original thought was to punish him for the damage to one of her shops, but her heart was melting towards the youth that sat in front of her. "Robert, why don't you take the book upstairs? Molly will show you to your room and help you get ready for dinner," she told him. He nodded as the maid appeared at the ring of a service bell. Robert followed her back through the house again, filling the silence with her chatter. She led him up the main staircase and down a different corridor. This was lighter and showed signs of life. Molly opened a door and motioned for Robert to go inside. He walked in and stopped, his mouth dropped as he looked around. It was a room fit for a princess. Taking up the middle of the room was a canopy bed filled with stuffed toys. It was a warm room, very welcoming, and Robert turned about to take the whole setup. Molly had disappeared into the ensuite bathroom, and the sounds of a bath carried through into the room. She told him to strip and stood in the doorway watching. She started to tap her foot as she waited for the young man to strip. Embarrassed, Robert started to strip as the maid watched, and as his clothes fell to the floor she collected them. Once he had finished undressing, Molly took everything from the room. Robert climbed into the bath and was surprised that the water smelled nice and it was bubbly. Downstairs in the library, Julia Stevens sat in her armchair. She was deep in thought. Her mind was in turmoil. How could her desire for vindictiveness had turned to a mother's love for a distraught child? She wondered if she was one of those women that was destined to be childless. Her feelings were confused as she sat staring into space. Time crept onward as the grandmother clock marked off the progression of seconds. Molly came into the room and curtsied to her mistress. "Yes, Molly? Ma'am, is dinner to be formal or informal?" "Formal, Molly. Please inform our guest. Oh, and ask our guest if they would wish to use the clothes in the closets. If they decline, postpone dinner till their clothes are clean." "Yes, ma'am." Molly curtsied again as she left the library. Julia stared into the fire again, and her thoughts freewheeled as she considered her problem. Although it was obvious that somewhere in the young man was a little girl waiting to be free. Would it be the right thing to do, to help the child to become free? She looked deeper into herself and tried to find what her motivations were. She took a deep breath and settled deeper into the armchair, relaxed, and took up the file again. She looked at the figures displayed on hard print. Her shops were doing well, and she considered if she could play some of her stocks against others and make a killing. As she sat with the files on her lap, she could feel her feelings swelling towards the boy/girl upstairs. An hour later, Molly walked back into the library with a smile. She dropped a deep curtsy to her employer. If indeed her smile could get any wider, it did, and she seemed to burst with news. As she stood there, a knock came at the library door, and it slowly opened. Julia looked up and her face registered a deep shock. Framed in the doorway was Robert, but it was not Robert. The raven black hair was brushed back into a pageboy style. He dropped a curtsy, although it was a bit clumsy, and she had to try and stifle a laugh at the attempt. "Good day, Miss Stevens. Is this formal enough for dinner?" he asked. Julia nodded, and the boy's face lit up at the unspoken compliment, and he seemed to blush. This further confused Julia, as the action was all girlish. Also, the dress that adorned the young frame was a child's party dress. Slowly Julia stood up and walked to the doorway and examined the dress for imperfections. "Ma'am, dinner is served, if the young miss would like to follow us," Molly said, breaking the silence. Julia led the way to the dining room, and she noticed that 2 places were set. Her was at the usual position at the head of the table, and to the left there was a second setting. A bottle of wine was by her glass, and a water glass was set at the second place. Next to it was a small jug of blackcurrant juice. Molly led Robert to the second place and pulled the chair back. After Julia had sat down, Molly sat the feminized young man at the place set for him/her. She poured a water glass full of the cordial for Robert and then poured wine for her mistress. Dinner was then served. Julia's was her normal gourmet fare, and the second set of food was from a nursery menu. For the first time since leaving care, Robert felt happy. He ignored the feeling that he was ridiculous dressed as he was. He was enjoying the feeling of the dress. He asked Miss Julia to refer to him as Roberta or Bobby. Miss Julia agreed to do this, and this caused him to smile. Dressed as he was and being treated the way he was being treated seemed to complete him. As they reached the dessert course, Molly served a child's portion of ice cream to him, and he attacked it with relish. Julia forwent the pleasure of dessert for a cup of coffee. She watched as the small serving of ice cream disappeared, and she considered what she would ask Robert/Roberta. Finally the meal was over, and the two of them headed towards a sitting room to watch some television. Julia was becoming concerned about what she was going to ask of the feminized male. She then remembered her credos. As a white witch, her magic could only be used of the good of the person it was aimed at. If what she was going to ask was wrong, the spell would not work. This made her able to relax as she watched a drama on the television. She reached for a small thin wooden box, which inside nestled a thin straight twig of white rowan. "Robert." "It's Roberta, ma'am." "Robert." "Yes, ma'am." "May I ask you a question?" "Ma'am." "Were you forced to wear the dress by Molly to please me?" "No, ma'am. Molly offered to have my clothes cleaned, but I saw the closets full of these pretties and I wished to look pretty. It has been a long time. When I was little and played house we would play dress up too, but never with a dress as pretty as this." The young man's face glowed as he remembered his happy times. "So Robert, if you could be Roberta full-time you would wish to be her?" "Ma'am, I guess you think me a pervert and sick." The expression changed to one of sorrow. "Robert, I was going to punish you for breaking the window of one of my shops, but my wishes have changed. You see the bracelet, it is called the Eye of Gaia. It allows me to do magic. I wish to give you your desire, but also I wish for a child, a daughter in fact. Would you become that daughter for me?" "Ma'am," the reply was squealed girlishly, "can I call you mommy?" "Yes, Roberta, you may." With that, Julia grabbed the rowan wand tightly and tapped it against her palm. She told Roberta to go and fetch an old book from the library. She scampered off, almost skipping to get the tome. Julia watched as the display of childish glee echoed from the hallway. Roberta skipped back into the sitting room with the volume. She placed the book on the lap of the woman, and she sat down on the floor waiting for the woman to speak. She watched as Julia flicked through the aged pages. She scanned the pages looking for a particular spell. She found it, and she took the page from the book and scanned it slowly. She lifted the rowan wand and then stood over Roberta. "Sala morta invictus," Julia intoned. As she spoke, a white light flowed from the wand and enveloped the person sitting on the floor. The light pulsed with a beat of life, and it grew strong then weak as it flowed out. A voice joined into the light, and it seemed to grow and fade with the light pulse. The face in the middle of the light softened and started to lose years. It then rounded and became more childlike. The body shrank and softened, and a layer of baby fat rounded the body. The face became concerned as sensations flowed through it. The clothes fell from the body, and the small form stood up a bit unsteadily. The area between the legs was bathed in a pink mist, but changes could be seen to take place. Julia watched the changes take place, and she was glad that there was no pain for the recipient of the spell. The light faded, and a small girl stood there in place of the small male body that had been there previously. She stood there, and the final change took place, and the raven black hair was changed to an auburn head of hair to match Julia's. As the child stood there, her thumb crept towards her mouth, and a look of concern crossed the little face. The child started to hop from foot to foot in distress. It looked up at Julia with a pleading look. Julie realized that with the change, the amount of cordial that was drunk by the larger body would be causing a slight problem. She rang for Molly, and when the maid appeared she asked the maid to get a potty chair from the nursery. The maid rushed off to do her mistress's bidding, but by the time she returned it was too late, and the transformed Roberta stood in the middle of wet clothes that she had been wearing before the transformation. Roberta stood in the midst of the sodden clothes, her face a bright crimson. She looked to her new mommy, and the corners of her mouth turned down. "I'm sorry, mommy." She started to cry. Julia walked to her new daughter and picked up the child and hugged her hard. She let feelings of warmth flow from her to ease the worries of the transformed adult, and she turned to her maid. Without a word, Molly picked up the soiled clothes and left the sitting room. Julia followed the maid and then carried the child upstairs to the bathroom that adjoined the master bedroom and the nursery. Molly quickly reappeared and started to draw a bath for the child and added a measure of bubble bath. The two women bathed the child and Roberta splashed in the water, letting her child side of free rein. After the bath, Julia settled her daughter in the nursery in a cot after dressing her and putting a pair of thick training panties on the child and let her sleep. Part 3, A Fresh Start. The following morning Roberta woke a little confused about where she was. She looked around the room. As she turned her head, her gaze was met by a large blonde teddy bear. It was huge. She reached out and did a double take as she noticed her hand. "My God, I must be still asleep and dreaming," she thought as she examined the chubby limb. It was obviously a little girl's hand. What confused her though was the fact that as the hand was moved, sensations traveled back to her mind. She lay there for a period of time that seemed eternal to her, moving her hand in and out of her field of vision. She could feel the hand brush the soft pink blanket that she was tucked under. She could see a set of bars in her vision, which were just tall enough to stop her falling out of the bed. Her mind started to reel as she realized how she was thinking. Everything was she and her and then mine. There was a bulk she could feel between her legs. It stopped her from drawing her legs together. Also the waist and legs seemed to be tight against her flesh and the bulk was clammy. "Mommy, mommy." She could hear a childish voice cry out, and it took her a few seconds to realize that the voice was hers. After she had cried out, a woman's face appeared in the doorway and it was lit by a gentle smile. Roberta recognized Mommy Julia, and she smiled as she watched the woman walk to the little bed. Julia walked over to her new daughter and looked down at the little girl lying under the blanket, and she reached down to tickle the child. The sound of a childish giggle filled the nursery, and Julia found herself laughing along with the little one. Molly appeared looking a little disheveled. She looked to her mistress and her new daughter, and she did a mental inventory of her duties and wondered how she would find time to help care for the little girl. With a resigned sigh, she set a bath to running for her employer to wash the child and set off back to her room to get her uniform on for the day. As she left the room, she heard Julia tell her to dress casually for the day, as after they had broken their fast they were going shopping. She rolled her eyes. The previous evening Julia had called her from the boutique to tell her she was bringing in a young man who had vandalized her property. She had thought that the young man would spend a few days being forcefully feminized by her employer. But events had taken a strange turn, and the young man had turned out to want to be a little girl from an early age. She dressed slowly. Even though she had been told to dress down, she always took care of her appearance so that she would not show her employer up. Once dressed in a casual business suit of a deep purple topped off with an off-cream blouse, she walked back to the nursery. Julia was putting the struggling girl into a pair of training panties. On the dresser was a pair of frilly rumba panties with a pretty party dress. The closet doors in the nursery were open and most of the space was empty. Finally, the struggle ceased as Julia talked to the newly transformed little girl, and the small child was dressed for the day. She looked no more than 3 years old, and the hair was long enough to be put into 2 braids. The child was sat on the dresser as her new mommy put a pair of ankle socks with a little frill at the top, followed by a pair of shoes that matched the pretty pink dress. Roberta was beginning to remember what had happened to her, and she started to smile. Finally, her deepest wish was granted. She was a little girl happy to be dressed prettily with a mommy who loved her. She was unsure about Molly, Mommy's maid, and stared at the woman with large hazel eyes that were framed by long soft lashes. Her thumb crept back to her mouth as she gauged the maid and wondered if this adult would be friend or just someone who helped Mommy. Molly could almost feel the force of the thoughts coming from the child, and she considered her own feelings for the new child. She considered it hard, and she realized that most of her dislike was from the fact that the arrival of the child meant more work. As she stood there thinking, Julia looked at the exchange of looks between the 2 other occupants of the house, and she thought about what this would mean to her maid. She came to a decision very quickly and smiled at her maid. "Molly, I have reached a decision. I am to become a stay-at-home mom." She laughed. "Yes, ma'am. That means that the care of Roberta falls to me." "Yes, ma'am." With that, the three of them retired to the kitchen where cook had prepared breakfast, oatmeal for Roberta and a continental breakfast for the two women. They discussed their plans and Roberta listened to the adults as they talked about the shopping trip. They walked out to the car and Roberta was placed in a child's seat in the rear of the 4x4. They pulled away towards the town and the start of the day's shopping. Roberta settled herself hugging the rag doll and she vowed to herself to be the best daughter in the world. She sighed as she remembered her past and her mistakes as Robert, and that side of her mind sighed. She had made a lot of mistakes in her life as Robert, following the crowd and getting into trouble. Sometimes a change of perspective is needed to see the proper picture. She smiled as she thought about a new life of pretty dresses, ballet and possibly a pony sometime in the future. She closed her eyes and let Robert drift away. Her little rosebud lips turned up into a smile as she settled for a nap as Mommy drove.